Excellent. Thank you very much. Just by way of introduction, my name is Megan Gilgan. I'm the Deputy Director of our Public Partnerships Division, and have been working very closely with our teams and the teams from Program Division in terms of bringing together these annual results reports this year. So it is my pleasure to introduce the report on education. Danielle, is here. Excellent. And so he'll do the presentation and then we'll move on to a panel.
Thank you. Switch to our yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks. And if it's okay, I'm going to kind of roam around. I'm not very good with podiums. Podia. Good morning. My name is Daniel Kelly. I'm an education specialist based here in New York. So I'm going to talk about our annual results report, but maybe a bit more broadly about the world we're in today in relation to education. So this is kind of where we are in the world today. We have some big numbers of children not learning. 387 million primary school age children and 230 million lower secondary school age children. And they're not learning the basics in terms of reading and maths. They're big numbers and it sounds bad, but what does it actually mean? So imagine you're in Sierra Leone, you're a 14-year-old, you're in maybe the second year of lower secondary school. You have a smaller brother or sister, they're in grade 2, and they come home with their addition problem. This is their addition problem. It's grade 2 level in Sierra Leone. Can you help them? You're 14, can you or can any of your friends do grade level math? How many of you do you think can? In Sierra Leone, how many 14-year-olds can do grade 2 level math? It's 3 in 10. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the most basic math, the most basic reading is not being learned. Children are not getting this basic foundation for all future learning at a huge scale globally. And part of the reason is because we're not starting early. They're not developing the most basic skills, the most foundational learning that we know is cost effective, that we know has a huge, long-lasting impact. And why is this not happening? Are we making investments that we know are cost effective? In low-income countries, only 2% on average of the education budget goes to early learning. So that's in low-income countries. What about UNICEF? Global leader in education, global leader in children. Are we doing any better? We're doing a little bit better. So 7% of all our education expenditure is going to early learning. And what about the global international aid community? The best minds, the best organizations working on education in the world today. Are we making that clever investment? Not at all. Very badly, in fact. 0.5% of all aid for education. I'm not talking about all aid, but just the education aid is going to this early learning. We're still investing in scholarships and post-secondary, but we are not being equitable and we're not being effective or efficient with our aid to education. So that's the global context. I want to briefly talk about some of the results that are detailed in the report, and they're structured around our results areas. So the first one for us is learning outcomes. And we have results in terms of system strengthening, and we see overall some progress. And we're seeing some progress in particular in relation to teachers and in early childhood education. The progress is a little bit more constrained in terms of community participation, or in terms of mother tongue, multilingual education, and also in terms of learning assessment. This is an area where we need to strengthen as a global community. We also have seen some progress in terms of addressing gender-related barriers in learning outcomes. And we've seen continued progress and results in terms of service delivery, going beyond system strengthening, providing approximately 11 million children with learning materials and training around 56,000 school management committees or parent-teachers associations. Within this strategic plan, we have a particular focus on skills development. Again, at the systems level, we've seen some notable progress, particularly in mainstreaming of skills development into the broader education system or training system, and in supporting gender equitable skills development. In addition to the system strengthening results, significant service delivery. So UNICEF has continued to work at the two levels of providing skills development for approximately 2 million children in 2018, but also in the systems level work. And in equitable access to education, we've seen progress across a couple of the dimensions that we see are crucial for progress in this area, in particular for sector planning, strategy development, and in resilience and emergency preparedness. However, there has been some constraints in progress in relation to data and EMIS and inclusive education. But again, some progress we've seen at the system level for gender equitable access to education, and in education in emergencies, where we reached 79% of the children we targeted for education support. So the results report is quite detailed, and it tries to unpack all these results with much more information in terms of what we mean by success in inclusive education, for example. But I want to just speak to some of the lessons learned or the challenges that we are seeing in working in this area in 2018. So education in emergency is a crucial area of engagement for UNICEF in education. We spent approximately $570 million US, represented by this big blue rectangle. So where did we spend it? Where were we able to spend it? Well, 56% occurred in Lebanon and Turkey alone. UNICEF's global education and emergency spending. Another 23% took place in 5 more countries. That meant that there is only 22% of our education and emergency spending in 2018 went for 137 countries. And within this 137 countries, there's significant level 3 emergencies. And these remain critically underfunded. We're talking about Bangladesh, Congo, DRC, and Nigeria. Emergencies, huge numbers of children, huge learning challenges, but not the adequate funding response. We've also learned a lesson over time of the importance of investing in systems and strengthening systems that will deliver sustainable and long-term results for children. It's not just about what we do with our funding, it's how we use that funding for the biggest impact. So here we have a representation of the $1 trillion that low and middle income governments have and spend on education every year. In comparison, UNICEF education outside of emergencies has approximately 605 million. This triangle is growing all the time. The fastest growing economies in the world are UNICEF program countries. We're talking about Ghana, Ethiopia, India. This triangle is growing very quickly. The small triangle of UNICEF is not growing at the same pace. So what we need to do is use our 605 million, use your contributions to influence what happens to the bigger pot. And that's why system strengthening work remains a key focus of what we're trying to do, because that is how we will have results at scale. However, there are some challenges associated with it. It takes time. It requires some specific technical capacities. It can be challenging to monitor and to communicate results to you and to others. And it can be difficult to sell to some donors because many people want quick results, quick fixes, something that's very visible. And that is why the thematic funding is particularly important in education. And we see how it is used. On the right is the system strengthening balance of thematic funding. It accounts for almost 80%, compared to the non-thematic funding, the more earmarked funding, which focuses more on service delivery. So just very quickly, I want to highlight some examples of where the thematic funding has been particularly useful. In Vietnam, we have an example where there is no funds available except for thematic, and its flexibility allowed UNICEF to invest in a pilot scheme on early learning curriculum that the government is now committed to scaling up. So this is very opportune funding, the type of funding being provided by Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Luxembourg, for example, and the NATCOMs in Norway and in the Netherlands. So this is my last slide. Very quickly, our upcoming priorities are going to be shaped by the forthcoming education strategy from 2019 to 2030. We're going to expand our focus on early learning and adolescence, maintaining focus on the most marginalized, especially those in humanitarian situations, and with a shifting of how we approach system strengthening, measuring and data, and innovations. However, none of this is going to happen without an increased focus on early learning. The learning gaps will continue to exist and grow unless we target early learning. We need enhanced support for education in emergencies, especially those emergencies that remain critically underfunded. And thirdly, the flexibility of thematic funding is crucial if we want to support system strengthening. And finally, I should say none of this would happen without you. So thank you very much. Thank you to our partners for all your support, especially those providing thematic funding, in particular Norway. And I will stop.
Can I give that to you? Excellent. You can keep it. Great. So now I would like to invite up to our panel to take your questions and further this discussion. Daniel will stay with us. Then from our education team, we will have Lisa Bender, Evelina Borisova, and we will also have Lauren Rumble from our gender team to join us here. Excellent. Great. Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, excellent. Right here in front. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sigge Skeie, and I represent the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, NORAD. First of all, thank you very much for an interesting presentation, and also very encouraging to see all the results that UNICEF has achieved within the education sector. I wanted to ask you to reflect a bit around the work that UNICEF is doing to support girls' education and gender-responsive education beyond promoting equal access. Then how does UNICEF work to ensure that gender equality is achieved in education and through education? And secondly, it would be interesting to have some reflections from you in terms of how UNICEF is working to ensure that the most marginalized populations can benefit from education, and especially with an emphasis of children with disabilities. Thank you.
Excellent. Is there another question? And then we'll go to the panel. I think, yes, right next to you. You can hand your microphone right.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting intervention and briefing. So I was so happy to hear about you talking about pre-primary education, because I think it's the first time I really hear that from UNICEF. That has been an area that's been neglected. We are always talking about the ordinary primary school, but I think what has happened before is of utmost importance for children's development. So perhaps you can elaborate a bit more about that. I think it's very interesting that it's now in focus. The other thing to reach a good quality in school is, of course, the teacher. And I wonder how much are UNICEF involved in teacher training, because that is also of utmost importance to have a good quality for children. What are the teachers trained in, and how much are they trained? So thank you.
Excellent. Maybe Lauren, we'll give you the floor first to talk about gender equality in education, moving beyond the access, and then our colleagues from education can decide how they would like to field the other questions on reaching the most marginalized, including disability, pre-primary and access to early learning, as well as the quality issue in terms of teacher training. Lauren.
Thanks so much, Megan, and lovely to meet all of you. And thank you for joining us today. So the greatest thing about UNICEF's education work at the moment is that we have such powerful data. It's one of the few sectors where we can really disaggregate data by gender, both in emergencies and in regular development settings. And that tells us what some of the barriers to education are. And what we know is that it's financial, it's simply unaffordable for many, and families choose to invest in boys' education rather than girls in many countries. We also know it's about violence, violence affecting girls predominantly, as well as boys, with sexual and psychological violence being predominantly affecting girls, as well as things like child marriage, customs, and culture. So we need to work on all of those fronts, social, physical infrastructure, as well as financial, leveraging that small triangle to make the big triangle work on systems reform. We have some really exciting programming on sexual violence in schools to make schools safer and more equitable. And that includes curriculum reform, teacher training, thank you for the question, making sure that there are places where girls and boys can report incidents of violence and seek professional care and support, setting up code of conduct in schools, as well as undertaking behind the scenes or public strategic advocacy on discriminatory practices. So, for example, we worked in Burundi and in Mozambique to really look at why pregnant girls were not accessing schools and to adjust the legislative policy and also from social norms environment so that girls could access school better. I'll just sort of start there for now, and we can come and pick back if there's any of interest. Do you want to?
Maybe perhaps to tackle the question on pre-primary and early learning, and then you can add other bits. Thank you so much for the question. My name is Evelina. I lead the work on early childhood education at UNICEF as a part of the education team. And I think our colleague Daniel has very clearly outlined some of the issues and challenges that we're seeing. But maybe to give those of you who are less familiar with the space of preschool education, the scope of the challenge, at the moment, 175 million preschool children are not in preschool. So this is a massive, massive gap that we're seeing just starting with access. And what we're seeing in terms of learning results is not surprising. Preschool education is absolutely a foundational kind of element of the education system to prepare kids for primary school. So these very basic math problems that we saw in Daniel's presentation, they're very early math skills, that knowledge of math concepts, knowledge of letters, knowledge of language, really begin very, very early. So we're really in a huge, kids are really at a huge disadvantage. And if you take this in terms of what it means for some of the countries where UNICEF works, in low-income countries, only 1 in 5 children has access to preschool education. In countries affected by emergencies, 1 in 3 children have access to preschool education. And when you look at issues of equity, the poorest kids are, of course, the ones who need these services the most, and they're 8 times less likely to attend preschool. So they are really starting their educational journey at a tremendous disadvantage compared to other kids who have access to these services. So this is just to give you the scope of the challenge. The way UNICEF thinks about it is this is not a last mile challenge. This is the beginning of a road challenge, and we're really strengthening the way we're working with governments, the way we're working with partners and with our country representation to really make this a priority. If I were to say 3 things that we're really focusing on, that would be equity. Of course, this is central to the way UNICEF works. So equity, not just in terms of making preschool available and making it a universal part of a child's learning journey, but making sure that those kids who need preschool have access to that. We're also focusing a great deal on system strengthening and quality. We know that just like any other levels of education, if we don't develop systems that can deliver quality at scale, preschool is not going to reap the benefits that it can have for children. So what we're doing with governments is focusing on quality standards, on teacher training, developing strong programs for early childhood educators that can then transform hopefully whole education systems for the better, appropriate curriculum, and strong engagement with families and parents, which we heard in an earlier session matters a great deal, especially in this younger age group. And the last big piece that we're doing, and I think we need all of you for that, is financing. So I think we heard in the presentation how little how little governments are putting into this crucial area of the educational journey of children, and how little donors and partners are doing as well. So as UNICEF, I think we're really trying to raise our voice for the importance of really strengthening investment, making sure that that investment is going in the right places, and ideally catalyzing national efforts to make sure that the public investment increases as donor investment goes in as well. We're going to need a whole lot of support in this area to really see the difference that we want to see.
Excellent. And maybe if someone from the education team can talk about reaching the most vulnerable and the most marginalized kids, including kids with disabilities.
Sure, I'll address that one and the one on teachers as well, because I think that's a particularly important point. So maybe in the interest of time, I went by it very quickly, but you'll see that under our work in terms of equitable access, there's a specific focus on inclusive education. And inclusive education focusing clearly on children with disabilities across a number of dimensions, whether there's the appropriate legal or policy frameworks in place, whether the attitudes of teachers and communities is in favor of the inclusion of children with disabilities, whether the schools are built to suitable standards to allow access to education, whether teachers are appropriately trained. So I think you will see that these dimensions are being measured and being focused on in a number of contexts that UNICEF are supporting. I think in Europe and Central Asia, for example, there's been a lot of work in supporting national systems to improve their data collection within schools to track whether children with disabilities are accessing education. In the mix, the new modules that have been released, there's specific modules on child functioning. So now we can contextualize that information, have much more greater detail on the level of a child's functioning and how that impacts on, one, their attending of school, but also crucially on their learning. So I think there's a lot of work in terms of highlighting these equity gaps that we've known for a long time, but kind of more informally, to really quantifying the scale of the challenge that is facing children with disabilities in terms of their right to education. And there's been a lot of work with our communications for development colleagues in addressing these kind of cultural or community-based barriers that we know are very prevalent in some communities. In relation to teachers, again, I touched upon it very briefly, but our work in teachers traditionally has often involved a lot of direct teacher training, and that continues, especially in places where the system is broken down or whether it's no longer functioning. So there's a lot of direct provision of teacher training, but in addition, there is a greater awareness and sense of whether a teacher ends up teaching the way we want them in the classroom is a product of many variables. So are teachers are they in the schools that they're supposed to be in? Does the system incentivize having the best teachers in the most challenging situations? Is there adequate school leadership in place? Is there a gender lens on how teachers are being trained and on the terms of the teacher practice? So I think, again, our approach to teachers is very much one at a system level, ensuring that the right teachers are in the right place and their pedagogy is suitable for those conditions. To highlight some work in particular, we've known for a long time that teacher attendance is a major issue in most of sub-Saharan Africa. There's a number of ongoing studies in Eastern and Southern Africa to highlight why they are not attending. So speaking to teachers, trying to understand what are their barriers, not viewing teachers as a problem that need to be solved, but as the crucial agents in change for children learning and working with them to help them overcome the barriers that they face.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I know that there's probably a lot more questions, and we hope we've whetted your appetite, both with the short presentation and also the discussion with colleagues. Just to say that one of the things we wanted to do with these reports was to give a kind of broad overview of the development and humanitarian landscape in these various areas, have a discussion about what the broader financing architecture is, and then dig into some of the results that have been achieved by UNICEF with partner support. So we hope that they can be useful to you in terms of engaging both on the broader education policy and strategic dialogue, as well as in terms of engaging with partners. I would invite now, thank you to all of our panelists.